what do you think happens when we die or the body passes away?
It's unknowable.
What's your opinion?
Next question. It's
what's your view on that then?
It's unknowable. It's interesting. If you're interested in it, and I mean, to some extent, a lot of us are. Well, I can always not put this up on YouTube, can't I? I can speculate. I have amongst my friends some absolute 100% rationalists who are kind of horrified at anything that they consider woo-woo and regard me as just about on the edge, you know, because they don't understand this. They're not quite sure whether it's woo-woo or not, you know. And one of them in particular, I'm thinking about this, and she is really, really firmly kind of rationalist. And I'm sort of idly thinking, if I did have a conversation about this with her, what would I say? What point would I make? And I would say two things which would, you know, suggest at least the possibility of an open mind about that question. If I can remember them both, I can remember one of them. One of them, it seems to me, is clearly the absolute mystery, and I'm using this word in a bit of a, it's a bit of a tricky word, but I'd use it, the absolute mystery of consciousness. I mean, I resist that word. I mean, I've written a fair amount about it, but I resist it because I think it's a really slippery word. I think it invites all sorts of weird ideas in. If I have another WhatsApp message from a friend recommending that I watch some Bernardo Kastrup or some Donald Hoffman on YouTube, I will simply scream and defriend them as a WhatsApp, whatever it is you do on WhatsApp. But nevertheless, you know, it's interesting that there is, I'm not even going to use that, I'm going to try and take that word consciousness out of it because it's so slippery. It's interesting that there is experience. It's kind of interesting, you know. There seems to be, let's say for the purpose of this conversation, there is a physical universe. Okay, well that's a mystery. I mean, of the sort of 2 or 3 most basic mysterious questions that philosophy wrestles with, one of them is that one, why is there something rather than nothing? So there's a physical existence, you know, that's kind of bizarre, isn't it? But what's even more bizarre is that physical existence is known. In other words, there's something that, I think it's a weasel word, but philosophers, psychologists call consciousness, to put it at its simplest. In other words, there's a physical universe, there's something rather than nothing, and there is experience of that, right? And how does a physical universe give rise to experience? And there's this wonderful question, you know, which I quote, and I've never managed to track down who actually put it this way, and I wish I could to acknowledge it, because I think it's the most wonderful question, and it's so simple. How does matter think? You know, how come matter thinks? Well, that's a mystery. So I think, you know, it's an open question. And why is there something rather than nothing? How does matter think? So the assumption that still trying to get, I'm staring at the wall because I'm still trying to keep this word consciousness out of this. So the assumption, you know, that matter thinks, I suppose, the kind of the physicist assumption usually is that consciousness or thinking or experience is an epiphenomenon of the physical. There's something about the physical that it becomes more and more complex. Organisms become more and more complex, and then as a byproduct of that complexity, experience or thinking or consciousness arises, and then there's all sorts of theorising about how that has an evolutionary advantage or whatever. Well, maybe, but it is pure speculation. It's total speculation. So it's certainly an interesting question, to say the least, as to how a physical universe gives rise to consciousness, subjective experience, whatever you want to call it. I think once that's recognised, then when it comes to the question that you started with, all bets are off. So the physicalist that says this is it, and all of this blah 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 and experience and consciousness is explained simply by the existence of matter, well, that's clearly, at our current understanding, rubbish. It's not explained, and I think it's not explainable, which is also one of the reasons I have no interest in watching long videos by Bernardo Castro or Donald Hoffman, because I think they're on a fool's errand. They're trying to explain something which is absolutely fundamentally not explainable. I think they're making, I'm not a philosopher, but I think they're making what philosophers call a category error, because they're trying to explain consciousness, in other words subjective experience, in terms of matter, and subjective experience isn't material. So it's just it's a different category. You can't explain one in terms of the other. So where does that leave us? Well, questioning, in the unknown, I'm kind of losing sight, probably about half an hour ago I lost sight of your original question, but your original question was more about, go on, remind me. It was more directly about
what happens when you die.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Does what I'm saying now have anything to do with that? I hope it fairly obviously does. Yeah. Because it's like the question is open.
So without the body, consciousness or whatever you call it doesn't depend on the body. So
we don't know. It's an open question. So those who say it does, which is the physicalist statement, I mean, it's just a statement of belief, isn't it? A statement of faith. We have no idea. There's nothing about physicality. There's nothing about even the functioning of the physical brain that explains why it gives rise to experience or consciousness. And Daniel Dennett wrote. Daniel Dennett is the highest paid philosopher in America, and I don't think he should be, but he is, nevertheless. He wrote quite a big book called Consciousness Explained, and quite a lot of other philosophers said what he's really written is a book called Consciousness Explained Away. Because he reduced it. This is what a lot of physicalists do. They reduce consciousness to things like the neuronal firings in the brain, brain activity and so forth, which explains nothing. I mean, obviously we know there's a connection between neuronal firings, etc., and experience. We know there's a connection, but we have no idea what that connection is. And if I can give you a quote from one of my own books, but it's actually a quote from somebody else that I quote. Roger Penrose, who usually I like, but I think sometimes he comes out with, in this particular case, I think he's come out with some sort of mad stuff. He's theorised that consciousness is to do with quantum activity in microtubules in the brain. Now, I don't know if you know what that means, I certainly don't, but then I'm not a physicist, but consciousness may be created by quantum activity of microtubules in the brain. What the fuck does that explain?
Yeah.
What the fuck does that explain? To put it in a somewhat more measured view, another physicist, Patricia Churchland, said of that, she said, declaring that consciousness might be explained by quantum activity of microtubules in the brain has about as much explanatory force as declaring that it's caused by pixie dust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this kind of making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you see the connection. You might think, well, what the hell has this got to do with my original question? But I think it does, because I think this is, a fundamental mystery, and it leaves the question open. So, I mean, I started off just by saying it's unknowable. Well, it is unknowable, but I think there are reasons why it's unknowable and why it's an open question. What do you think?
Well, if the body dies, then it seems like it probably wouldn't just be nothingness, because there's something here now. So could potentially be that there's just an experience without the physical form, but that's still speculation. No one can ever know, because obviously you can't come back.
Going back to what I would, if I ever had this discussion with this very, very rationalist friend of mine, going back to that, there were two things I would say. That's one of them, the kind of unknowability of the nature of subjective experience and where it comes from. And the other thing that I would add to that is non-ordinary experiences. So I think anyone who's had non-ordinary experiences, which is a lot of people, it leaves an open question. So I've had non-ordinary experiences, possibly everybody in this room has, and I think it also leaves the question open.
Because those non-ordinary experiences can't be measured or scientifically proven, then it'll always remain a mystery, probably.
Will what we're talking about always remain a mystery? Probably. I think consciousness certainly will.
Unless they manage to upload consciousness into AI or something.
Yeah, well, yeah.
That's
It'd
very
still
hard.
be a mystery, wouldn't
Yeah.
it, as to what it is they've uploaded,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, well, it's interesting if you're interested in it, yeah.
It was just something that popped into my head.
Yeah.
But then from non-duality there's a distinction, like the world thinks that when this body dies,
Yeah.
then this person dies.
Yes.
But I think from non-duality it's when the person can die well before the body dies. Are you with me?
Yes, I am with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how can I phrase this? Yeah.
I think, though, that we're using, I think philosophers might call that a category error, because I think we're using the word person in somewhat different senses in that.
No, I appreciate everything you were saying prior to.
Yeah.
Was talking in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he
So
says
we might say in non-duality terms, yes, it's possible for the person to die. Dying before we die, from the mystics. It's possible for the person to die, but that doesn't mean the end of experience. The physical organism goes on functioning, experience continues to happen, this voice continues to go yada 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 yada,
Yeah.
or whatever. So that's very different to physical death.
Yes.
So you could say, well, non-dual seeing doesn't necessarily entail the end of the biological organism. I mean, it might sometimes, but if it does, then there's not going to be anybody here sitting in a seat talking about it.
What does Satchitananda mean? I think it means consciousness.
Consciousness,
blissful.
energy, bliss.
Yeah.
Consciousness, energy, bliss. which I think is great.
Mm-hmm.
You want a description? Well, what is this? Satchitananda, consciousness, energy, bliss. If we don't get too precious about that word consciousness, and we just take it to mean, you know, that there's experience. So, energy, clearly there's energy because something seems to be happening. You can't have something seeming to happen without energy. Or if you like, to make it simpler, something is happening. We want to be a little bit less careful with language, so there's clearly energy. Consciousness, kind of obvious, because there's not just something happening, but it's known to be happening. So, it seems to me those two lie in the realm of the bleeding obvious. Ananda, bliss, well, that's a lot less obvious, isn't it? It's a lot less obvious. But then the suggestion from here and from many other places is that when this is seen, then it becomes obvious.
I remember now what it was.
Bliss, unconditional love, however you want to put it. Yeah. And you could say it's seeing that, this does sound dualistic, talking about that element of existence as if existence has several elements. Well, we can't talk about it without pretending it has. It seems to be seeing that element of existence, the unconditional love, that finally puts an end to seeking. So what we sometimes call awakening, like an initial awakening, it often has that seeing of emptiness, and a lot of the understanding that seeing of emptiness brings, but it doesn't put an end to the dissatisfaction of the person, or not usually. And we could suggest that's because the nature of this as unconditional love isn't seen. And when that's seen, that's when the seeking ends.
Yeah. Because it might be linked to non-duality, because I remember the definition I was given. It's Satchitananda is one energy that is conscious of itself and is blissful.
Put it that way, yeah. Yeah, well, it seems to me intimately connected with non-duality. It seems to me it's kind of fundamental. It's the neatest way it's ever been put. What is this? Well, it's conscious. Well, tricky word, but let's let it lie for now. It's conscious. There is energy, and ultimately it's seen that there is unconditional love. And as I've often said before, the difficulty with that phrase is not the word love, it's the word unconditional.
Because people seem to think unconditional love is loving someone despite their faults.
Rubbish. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what the mind will make it. Of course. Yeah. It's not, is it? It's unconditional love. It means it embraces everything, including that which the mind most hates, or finds most disgusting, or finds most depressing. It's a really, really tough. It's really, really tough. Unconditional love.
Yes.
My pitch is that the human, the person, whatever you want to call this, the flesh and blood puppet, the divine puppet, the cosmic puppet, whatever you want to call this, can never get unconditional love, because this always lives in conditionality. Nevertheless, this can drop, and then the nature of everything as unconditional love can simply be seen. It can't be understood, but it can simply be seen, and then all the kind of blibbly blabbly whatever of the mind that goes, I love this, I hate that, blah 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 blah, just becomes irrelevant. And then what will be left will be a character who I will guarantee certainly will not be a character who lives out unconditional love. They may pretend to, in which case they will probably get a terrible case of spiritual indigestion. But I guarantee the character that's left when this is seen does not live out unconditional love. But unconditional love can be seen. I'm using the word seen very loosely. Known, whatever, however we want to put it. It's got nothing to do with our relations with people.
Do you think someone like Jesus, for example, was living out unconditional?
I don't know, I have no idea. I don't know
Or
whether
an
Jesus
extremely holy person that had an
in the history of humankind, I have no idea whether Jesus existed as a person or, was another invented Mediterranean God-man of whom there were many, or several. The Jesus story is a very common story. Was a very common story around the Mediterranean at the time, but obviously the church doesn't want us to know that, but that's a different matter. Who knows, But we look for, and we have this phrase, don't we, sort of selfless love or loving selflessly or whatever, so we look where we can, but, examples of selfless love. And this topic came up in another talk I was giving years ago, and somebody said, what about a parent's love for their child? Surely that's unconditional. And somebody else at the meeting gave a wonderful reply long before I could think of anything. They said, well, obviously it's not unconditional, it's conditional on the fact that they're your child. So the love of a child, the love of a parent for their child is highly conditional.
So otherwise you could swap the child and the love would still be there.
Yeah. I think one of the resistances that some people, some minds have to what's being said here is that we love stories of nobility. Why not? Stories of nobility and this. What happens is just what happens. I mean, you can still have your stories of nobility if you want to. You can have anything, any story you want. But the mind doesn't want to go, oh, it's just a story then, is it? Because the mind wants to say, no, that nobility that I've got this story about is real. It's real nobility. Well, have it if you want. But it's a story. Everything that the mind comes up with is a story. I'm catching the 9:30 train back to Tunbridge Wells. That's a story. I'm going to have cheese on toast for breakfast tomorrow. That's a story. There's justice in which a parent's love for their child might arise. There's justice in which the thought might arise, that's really noble. That demonstrates that there's unconditional love. It's just a thought. It doesn't matter, it's not right, it's not wrong, it doesn't matter, it's a thought. As I'm talking, I'm sort of getting a sense as to why this communication is so resisted by so many people. All our values and beliefs are just stories. as mental constructs, all our values and beliefs are just stories. I mean, our values come from impulses which are deeper than mental constructs, and on that level, they're part of our evolutionary biology, our psychology. If the mind's looking for noble stories, it's not going to find any there. If you want noble stories, go for the religious or the spiritual. Don't go for the mystical.
What's the distinction between religious, I know, spiritual, I know, mystical versus spiritual?
If it's a story you can understand, that your mind can make sense of, and you can relate to it, with the moral sense and so forth, then it's probably spiritual, right? If it's a story which, as the kind of word mystical suggests, just makes you go, that's a complete mystery.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
You can't really make anything spiritual or heroic or moral, out of a story whose starting point is there isn't anybody. But that's the mystical apprehension. There isn't anybody.
Yeah.
How do you create a spiritual or heroic story out of that? There isn't anybody.
Just cuts everything away.
There's nothing and everything.
Yeah.
There's love, and until I see I am nothing, I cannot see that I am everything. To go back to my favourite mystic. There's no one. There's no one. There's no one. So there's no one who does anything. So there's no one who does anything heroic. How do you make a story out of that?
There's no one who knows anything, does anything.
Well, there's no one.
Yeah.
So obviously there's no one who knows anything or who does anything, therefore there's no one who does anything heroic. So how do you make a story of nobility out of that? Spirituality, we want stories of, we want stories. And some of those stories may be stories of nobility. But there's lots of stories of nobility in, the spiritual, amongst spiritual narratives. The monk who meditated in the snow so passionately halfway up a Japanese mountain, and so determinedly, and for so many hours and hours and hours that they carried him back to the monastery and had to amputate his feet. But he didn't care because his heart and mind was so fixed on the Buddha. And anybody in this room could make up these stories, and some of them are true. Love it. It's so attractive. Set that against, there's just this. I'm going to suggest two things. Firstly, it's not surprising that the mind says, well, I don't want to hear that, that's just ridiculous. That's one thing. But the other thing that I want to suggest is that if that is seen, set that wonderful story of spiritual nobility and suffering overcome and so forth. Absolutely wonderful, such a heroic story. Set that against the simple, just absolute sort of singing of what this is, and that story's nothing. It's just a passing thought. It's gone. Where is it? It's gone. It has no value. compared to absolute simplicity, but the seeing of that absolute simplicity. This is arising out of nothing. This voice, these movements, that shirt, whatever's being felt, the warmth or possibly the coldness now, the cup in the hand, is arising out of nothing. Who cares about some monk halfway up a mountain in the snows of Japan? I'm sorry, I don't want to sound heartless, even though I know I'm sounding heartless.
Richard, often I'm asked, where are you going, Imran? I'm going to a non-duality meeting. Someone might say, and they say, what's that? I don't know what to say. What would you say if someone asked you, where are you going, Richard? I'm hosting a non-duality meeting, or whatever.
Yeah.
What would you say non-duality is?
Well, unless I know that it's someone who, I get a sense they are genuinely interested in this, I would be as evasive as possible.
What if someone's genuinely asking? So tell me what that is. What's non-duality?
If you get the sense that they're open, then whatever. But it's usually it's not that, and I waffle my way out of it. I usually say so. Well, it's kind of vaguely in the sort of ballpark of Buddhism, but not really. And by the time I've got to the end of that sentence, they glazed over and lost interest. But I wouldn't go there unless you get a genuine feeling. I get a lot of communications, I get a lot of emails and people ring me up and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And quite a few of those are about people's frustration because, something's grabbed them about this and they cannot, they feel that somehow it's cutting them off from their friends and family or whatever, and they can't get their friends and family, whatever, to have any empathy or to get on board or to take this. Well, why should they? Would you have done, I don't know how far back we go, 20 years ago, would you have done? 25 years ago, I wouldn't have. So if there's not an openness there, I'd say it's just an invitation to frustration.
I get it. Sometimes people are just asking, just like you ask, where do you play football? Or something. It's just a question that they're hoping to end up with a definition that can compartmentalise what this person is interested in.
Yeah.
Well, a bit like if you said psychology lecture, they know what that is.
Yeah, well then say something that covers that. Like, I say, well, it's kind of vaguely in the area of philosophy and a bit like Buddhism, and that's it. Yeah. But people do get into serious difficulties with this, with family, with friends, and particularly with spiritually minded friends. So if we've come to this from a kind of spiritual background, we've hung around in that kind of group or whatever. I mean, I've come across people, I've said this many a time, I've come across people who've been asked to leave their meditation group, or their guru group or whatever.
I was in a law of attraction group.
Right.
So
how's that going?
There isn't the resonance there.
No.
So I'm still on the WhatsApp group, but I never interact.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you interacted in this way, I don't think it would be welcome.
No, of course not. And I can't interact with that. And if I said something, there might be a resonance from one or two people. That would be it.
Long ago, I was invited to do a talk in Hastings by a woman who was really into this. I mean, a lovely one. She's really into this, and she invited all her friends. What she'd forgotten to take into account was that all her friends were deeply into spiritual stuff. I mean, they all had tarot cards and crystals and gave readings and things like that, and I'm sure everybody in that room, apart from me, owned a copy of The Secret, The Secret, which is a law of attraction book or whatever. And God, you could have cut the hostility in that room with a knife within about 4 minutes or 7 minutes.
You were speaking?
Yeah, I was speaking there, and so she invited her friends because she was so keen on it herself. She'd seen Tony and so on. She'd forgotten to take into account that this was not where her friends were. the hostility was palpable.
I think possibly religion and religious people and spiritual people, they'll possibly be the least interested in this.
I would say they're likely to be the most hostile.
Yeah.
People who are just kind of, physicalists, materialists, scientific materialists, rationalists or whatever, are probably just not interested.
It's
Might
interesting.
think it's a bit mad, but Buddhists might take this as a deadly insult.
Sam Harris is a self-proclaimed atheist,
Yeah.
and he has a book about how religion, basically just decrying religion, but he's very much coming from the point of view that there's no self and no free will, and he's spoken to certain Buddhist people as well, so he's been on a spiritual path, but he sees it in a very kind of scientific way. It's quite interesting to watch his videos if you're interested.
Okay.
Sometimes when people get interested in this, there can be that, it's almost like the kind of, the new convert enthusiasm for it. So suddenly we fall in love with this, and now we want all our friends and family to fall in love with it. Usually a big mistake. Yeah.
I feel like that with my family as well, because they're kind of into non-duality, but from my brother's read a lot of I Am That for years and years.
Right.
Read a lot of what, sorry?
You know the book I Am That?
I am that, yeah, okay.
Yeah. But I gave him other books by you and stuff, but it just never resonated. So
Yeah.
it's exactly as you said, it's best to just kind of politely skirt around it and just say, my mum gets it, and she's kind of a lot more open-minded
Yeah.
with certain people, because he has just this really committed view of Maharaj and that teaching. Yeah. But I guess if he's ready, whenever, he might go on to something else. But it's not for me to. I felt like there was kind of a duty or some kind of impulse, like I should show him something else. But then I realised that, like you said, there's quite a strong reaction against anything else.
Well, it's a very human impulse to want to share our enthusiasms with our friends and family, but in some cases, and this is one of them, I think it's an impulse that should be strangled at birth.
Yeah, I agree.
This I find is a bit different, non-duality, because resonance is not the same as interest. One can talk to someone about 1,001 other subjects and they'll be interested.
Oh, right.
The resonance with this is something else. It's an energetic. There isn't a cognitive interest in this to come here and whatever. There's something else going on. It's an energetic type. Literally a resonance.
But I think the pushback that you'll get in terms of talking to other people about this is probably more from people who have a committed spiritual view or path.
Yeah.
Maybe also people who have a committed religious view or path, maybe. Yeah.
I think even if you didn't have either of them and you said to somebody there's no self, they would find that quite challenging.
Of course.
Or free will.
Of course.
Free will, absolutely. I can't remember if I've already said this, chapter in my last book about free will, and one of the first lines was, if you ever want to start a row with somebody, one of the easiest ways to do it is to assert that there's no such thing as free will,